Hello and welcome to today's podcast. I'm Susan Guthrie, your host, and this is going to be a really interesting podcast episode for you listeners because we are focused not on your divorce and beyond, but on your marriage. So that might be your beyond. For many of you, it will be your beyond, but we are really going to be talking about how to avoid that divorce and how to, as my guest said, consciously couple rather than consciously uncouple. And I was so excited when she wrote into me with this idea of the episode. So I'm delighted to have Monica Mazet with me today. She is one of my attorney colleagues from California. Monica handles high net worth and ultra high net worth divorces up in you're in the San Francisco and the Bay Area, right, Monica? Lucky you. That is such a nice place to be. And certainly a place where you're going to find those high net worth and ultra high net worth divorces.
Yes, it's great. I have a lot of clients in Silicon Valley. So as you can imagine, being in the tech hub, we deal a lot with private companies, prenups, business issues. So it's very interesting.
I bet no day is the same as any other day. So, and that's actually sort of where I think this probably came up for you. You mentioned the term prenup, the words prenup. And I know, we'll talk a little bit about prenups, maybe in what I think most of my listeners think about prenups as, but you also have, a relatively forward thinking, I think, for our profession, divorce attorneys, thinking about ways to make prenups a way to keep people together, for people to really go into that prenuptial agreement and use that as a vehicle to sort of bring themselves together and work through some issues before they ever get to the point of that prenup being needed to being used during a divorce or down the road. So I'm excited to talk about this. I do want to point out, because this is something that you have achieved or have gotten the certification in California as a certified family law specialist. And some of my other guests have had that, but I've never talked about what that is. And I do want to highlight it because I think it's a really special aspect of California family law that not many other states actually have. I practice also in Connecticut and New York, and they don't have this sort of a designation. Can you explain to everyone what a certified family law specialist in California is?
Sure. So in California, to become a certified family law specialist, you have to be practicing a certain number of years, and you also have to pass a test. It's a written test, and it's basically testing your knowledge about everything family law on a pretty advanced level. And so if you meet that test, they'll certify you in family law. There's also a peer review component to that. So you do have to submit referrals from the time that I did it. It was at least 5 opposing counsel. And I thought that was really interesting that they ask you to put names of opposing counsel, but that's really how to get a whole, how to test someone's kind of reputation, how they work is to ask the people that have to work against them. So that's what California does. It's a pretty rigorous test. People usually study for, at least a month for it. It's not the bar exam, but it's kind of like a mini truncated family law exam. And so in family law in California, it's a big deal. And if you want to practice kind of in the high net worth area, it's really important that you get that certification.
Yeah. So if you're a California individual who's going through divorce or any family law matter and you see CFLS on an attorney's bio page or after their name, you know that this is someone. Monica's being very modest because when she said it's, a high level of knowledge of family law in California, this is a very rigorous test. This is very hard to pass. It's beyond a mini bar because it's so in depth into the particulars of California law. And as someone who had to take California's bar exam not that long ago, after 30 years of being out of law school. That alone was really hard to do. So I never took the CFLS exam, but bravo to you. And I asked you to go through that because I want people to understand, you know, you're really at a very high level of the practice in California. And you deal with a lot of people who have very complicated financial and personal issues in their divorce. So when you're talking about this conscious coupling and doing a prenup that helps people to stay together, to consciously couple, I think that that is a significant issue for people to understand. And so I want to talk about that. So what made you think of consciously coupling? We've all, and I do want to reference, conscious uncoupling comes from Catherine Woodward Thomas, and of course we all know it because of Gwyneth Paltrow and Chris Martin's divorce. But it is conscious uncoupling is one form of going through divorce, but conscious coupling is a very different thing.
It is. So I'll tell you what gave me the idea and why I've become such a proponent for this concept. You know, after, you know, over 20 years of handling people's divorces, I can't tell you how many times a client, you know, I would explain what the default law is in California, you know, like all your earnings are community property, or, you know, that business you started during marriage, well, that's community. And they would say, but no one told me. And
Wait a minute.
hey, I didn't know I was signing up for that. And they're exactly right. You know, if you think about it, you know, we sign a contract when we rent a car, you know, we sign a document when we're purchasing a house or, you know, leasing an apartment. But the states don't hand you a pamphlet when you get married to let you know what you're signing up for. So you're given almost a template contract that you've never seen and that you've never signed, but it's going to apply to you. And I started finding out that the more I talked to people, you know, had they known that, they would have maybe adopted some of it, but probably would have wanted other provisions for certain things. And they didn't even realize that that was an option. And I said, this is exactly what a premarital agreement can do. You don't have to accept the default law in your state. It might not work for either of you. It might not be what either person wants or what works best for that couple. So I think, you know, going through the premarital agreement process and, you know, working with an attorney and finding out before you get married, okay, what's the standard contract I'm going to be given? And how, if anything, do we want to change that? You know, and it's not black or white. It's not like you have to accept the default or opt out. You can really, at least in California, except for child-related things, agree to anything that you want. You know, so I have some clients that say, well, if I start a business during marriage, I don't think it should be all community, but I also don't think it should all be my separate. I think it should maybe be 60% my separate and 40% community. I mean, people can really agree on anything they want. And I think, you know, not only does that agreement dictate what happens if there's a divorce, which means less costly, less time consuming, less emotionally draining process, but it makes the couple have to really think about these things. You know, how do we feel about, you know, our earnings during marriage? How do we see, you know, spending during marriage? You know, how do we feel about, you know, estate planning issues? It brings up all of these things that normally you're not going to ask on a first or 20 or 30th date. I mean, you just don't talk about it. So I think that we're moving away from more of the traditional marriage accepting the default and more to people being aware that they have this option and wanting to create something that's really tailored to themselves. Here in Northern California, where I practice, most of my premarital agreement clients are millennials who live and work in Silicon Valley. They're all very knowledgeable about these agreements. There doesn't seem to be as much bias or taboo about them or bringing them up. A lot of the couples, both of them work either in tech or have their own companies, and they are very much interested in making their own rules. And so right now I have 50 to 60 premarital agreements going on right now.
That's a sizable amount. Good for you.
And the majority of those are under 40, are couples under 40 that are privy to this concept and really want to figure something out that works for them. So, I think as the younger generations are getting married, I think we're going to find that they are much more interested in creating their own agreement and their own path than accepting, the default in California. And so I predict there's almost going to be like a mandatory prenup where people have to make choices before they get married about what they want to adopt. And other countries have something similar to that already. And the US never has. But I think that's where we're headed towards. And I do think that it's going to make for stronger marriages, for one, because you've been forced to talk about all of these issues. But two, if you have to unwind the relationship, it's going to be a lot easier because you've pre-agreed on what's going to happen if that's the case.
Yeah. Well, I mean, think about it. You opt in or opt out all the time, right? We enter into some sort of agreement to download an app on our phones and we opt in and opt out. And I think it's very significant for listeners out there to understand because I don't think people, and I found this throughout my career as well, people have absolutely no idea that when they walk down the aisle or Ben and Jen just did it, in Vegas. I don't know if there was an aisle, but, Elvis serenaded them on their way down. They don't understand that going through that ceremony and the romance and the all of that creates this legal relationship and these obligations and rights that exist from that moment forward. From the minute that marriage is legalized, there are rights and obligations that they have to each other that they never had to each other in the past. And when you go into this prenuptial agreement and this discussion around prenuptial agreements, that is your one and only, or at least your first opportunity, I guess I should say, not one and only opportunity to really, one, talk about what those rights are and those obligations that go into place, and to opt in or opt out or vary, as you were saying. You made me think another one of our California colleagues, Laura Wasser, when I was interviewing her, said something to the effect of, if you can't sit down before your marriage and talk about these things, you should probably be thinking about whether you should be getting married at all. Right? These are your money and your efforts to jointly together in creating your partnership. Yet so many people don't want to have those conversations. I think it's also significant what you pointed out, that as younger generations are getting married, because I think we know that people are getting married older. They're getting married after they've been single for a time period and after they've both had that opportunity to go out and sort of amass their own estate, their own assets and liabilities, and have their own personhood established, both financially. So are you seeing that taking away some of the stigma around going into a prenuptial agreement or talking about that?
Yes, I think there's two reasons that there's less of a negative stigma to these agreements. I mean, one is the younger generations have read about these agreements, in the news and the tabloids, probably their whole lives in terms of celebrities having them. So they know what they are. They've heard the name before. And also, like you mentioned, we're finding couples where both of them are educated, both are working, right? And so we don't have, as we've had in past generations, a more kind of what we would think of as a traditional marriage where one person's working and one person's staying at home. So both people come to the table feeling like they have something to protect. And I think it's a little bit different perspective. And both are equally interested in having the agreement, as opposed to there being a big disparity in the wealthier person, wanting this agreement. It's really both people have a vested interest. Both people have businesses or ideas or stock options, that they want to talk about. And I think that's a big difference and a major driver of that generation, really embracing these agreements and wanting them and, calling around. I mean, we can't even, we have to turn them away. There's so many right now, the few of us that do them, we can't handle all of them. That's how many there are, and what a big demand there is for them.
Which is relatively new. I mean, I can say, having practiced for 32 years, and I was in the New York City area, we have a lot of hedge funds. A lot of those people, would want prenups, but this was always a very touchy topic. And generally, people were coming and knocking on my office door a week or two before the wedding. This was not something that got brought up as a conversation between couples. Most often, it was something that was kind of sprung by one of them on the other. And I suspect you're seeing something different these days, as you describe it. When do people now, you mentioned you have 50 or 60 prenups. When are people coming to you to start this conversation?
Usually not early enough, but it ranges everywhere from 6 months before their wedding, to 3 months or 2 months before. I think ideally you want to leave yourself at least 6 months, because it's easier on the couple, because you're going to have to deal with this while you're also wedding planning. So, you want to kind of get ahead of this so that you can focus on the last minute, wedding details, and not be talking to me a couple days before the wedding. So I would say the sooner the better. I also have a lot of couples that get engaged and they start this process and we don't have a wedding date yet. I mean, that's really ideal because there's no timetable. They're just going to get this agreement done and then they'll set a date, for the wedding. And
I was just going to ask, because I think that's what most people might be asking themselves or questioning right now. What does the process look like? What is it that happens when, say, a couple comes to you? Is it a couple that comes to you, or is it one party or the other?
Both. So I mediate premarital agreements, which not a lot of people realize they can be mediated. So I meet with the couple
Yay!
on Zoom. Just the two of them. Now they're each going to have their own attorney review the actual document before they sign it. But in our Zooms, it's just the three of us. And we go through and we talk about all the default in California and what their thoughts are about it. And do they want to change that, and why? And I try to provide them with examples or different options. But it's really talking through those issues together collaboratively, the three of us, to reach an agreement that works for both of them and is really kind of what they both want. And then I draw up the agreement and they each have an attorney that reviews it with them and signs off on it. I think the majority of my prenups, I represent one of the soon to be, married. The other person has their own attorney and we kind of trade emails and drafts between the attorneys. But again, very collaborative. This isn't a divorce. This is a prenup. So if one person has one idea and the other person has another, we can always find a way to, meet in the middle and, draft something that, works for both of them. So it should be a very collaborative process. The more the couple talks at home, the better. You can't just rely on your attorneys to do the talking because this is so personal. And this is your life. So you do have to have sometimes some hard discussions at home, about financial issues or, estate planning, provisions. I mean, no one wants to talk about money, divorce, or death. Those are the three things people want to avoid. And those are the three things you have to talk about. So, I try to coach my clients to make it easier for them to bring these up at home and give them some talking points or some examples, but it really should, most of my clients, and sometimes there's hard times during the process where they've really had to dig deep and have difficult conversations. But once we're done with the agreement and they put it in a drawer, hopefully to never look at again, they look back and think, wow, I think that going through that process was actually really helpful. We would have never talked about that, if it wasn't for putting this agreement together. And sometimes
that's so important for people to understand, because we know as divorce attorneys that financial issues between a couple are one of the number one reasons people end up in divorce. And so, in some ways, having these, what you've characterized as difficult conversations, and I certainly know that they can be, but having those discussions and coming to some resolutions or understandings can help avoid that later conflict that we've seen so many people have.
Yeah, and another component to these premarital agreements is both people have to list their assets and their debts, right? And so, both people have to put their cards on the table, and you get to see, if someone has student loan debt or credit card debt, or, what their assets are. That could be an uncomfortable question to ask someone, and that in this process, they have to provide it. So you get to see it, and there's a lot of transparency there, which I think is really helpful, because again, without going through this process, the state doesn't require anything like this or premarital counseling. When I was in high school, my local church parish priest did premarital counseling for couples that wanted to get married in the church, and he required that they come to the first premarital meeting with their credit reports, and they swap them.
I like that, priest.
That was like a very early, marital agreement, right? Because it was like, well, you got to put it all out there, right? Everyone should see, what there is. And that's kind of what a prenup does.
Well, and significant point you've made there. And I do want people to understand California has a statute about prenuptial agreements, and there are certain like boxes you have to check for that agreement to be considered enforceable under the law. And I just want to point out to listeners, I think every state in the country right now has some sort of prenuptial agreement statute. The requirements for validity may vary, but they generally are some of the things that you've already mentioned. There has to be full financial disclosure. Both parties either have to have their own attorneys review the agreement, or at least have had the opportunity. California has a few other requirements.
Yes, in California, a new requirement that just came out a few years ago is that the final version of the agreement has to sit for 7 days before the couple signs it without any changes to it. So you have to build in that window for, making sure you can sign it before the actual wedding ceremony.
So, because I had one couple, I remember back in the day doing a prenuptial agreement, and they had me deliver the final version to the church so they could sign it just before they walked down the aisle. That would not work in California. It reminds me of when you join a gym and they have to give you a 3-day right of rescission on those agreements. This is sort of the same thing. Let everybody really think about it, but understand those requirements are put in place so that everybody is protected and everybody is getting full disclosure, is fully supported in signing that agreement. Because, and here's another aspect I want to make sure we talk about, once you sign that agreement, they are generally enforceable.
Yes, right? the courts, at least in California, and I think this is probably true of every state, they want these agreements to be enforceable because it keeps people out of their overcrowded courtrooms with their divorces. So, they want public policy. They want people to enter into these agreements. They want them to be able to rely on them. And, they want them to be upheld so that people aren't, litigating, in court. And in my experience, they're generally upheld. These agreements should be fair and they should be balanced to have a valid agreement, is what I tell my clients. If you have an unfair or imbalanced agreement, can likely be set aside if it's challenged. So what's the purpose of that? The agreement really should provide certainty to people in case the relationship ends, but it needs to be fair in order to be enforceable, in my opinion. So it has to be balanced and it can't be one-sided.
Right. And I ran into that in a case where I had one client, he had been through a divorce. So he wanted his prenup for his second marriage to basically say, if she leaves me, she gets zero, zilch, and nada. And I had that conversation with him at the time that's fairly draconian and not likely to be upheld at the time. I don't want you to waste your time and money entering into agreement today that will have no bearing in a courtroom down the road if it were to be called into question. But if the people have a fair opportunity to sit down at a table, or I love the fact that you mediate them on Zoom, that's my world, my listeners know, that, you know, as long as everybody has their chance to be heard, be fully participatory in this and have full disclosure, these agreements are actually a better way for if a divorce happens, a better way in many ways for people to proceed through that divorce process, because you mentioned it earlier, there's less cost, there's less time, and there's less stress for people because you've already worked through these issues.
Yeah, you know, even when I represent the less wealthy person, sometimes there is a disparity, and sometimes I'm representing the person with a lot less. And, you know, sometimes they can be apprehensive about these agreements, but I tell them this is good for you. This is your opportunity to ask for what you want while you guys still like each other. Try doing this 10 years ago, 10 years from now, possibly, when you guys can't stand each other. A lot harder. So, you know, I think if you're the person coming in with less, this isn't bad. This is great. This is great.
I so love that you said that. That is definitely going to be an Instagram post. Everybody look for it, because that's the quote of the episode. Because you're 100% right. And I've had that conversation with people, you know, do not, because you do run into this as well. I'll sign anything, just put it in front of me. I had a real tug of war with one couple where I was representing the person who was really coming from with into the relationship with much less financially. And he didn't even want to read the agreement. He just said, whatever he wants in it, I'll sign it. I don't want to go over it with you. I just give it to me to sign. And I kept saying, you know, this is really your opportunity to have those conversations. You won't have that opportunity down the road if you sign it today. So it is a truly significant contract when you do enter into it. But as you pointed out at the top of the episode, you're already entering into a contract. You just don't know what's in it in most cases. Gives attorneys shivers down their spine, and in so many cases never sign an agreement you don't know what's in it. But let me ask you, because we've talked about the financial side of prenuptial agreements. I just recently, in my August episode, headlines episode, there was an article about the Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez marriage that recently happened. And back when they were engaged 20 years before they got married, they did have a prenuptial agreement. It was widely reported, at least in the press, that it had a no cheating clause that basically said if Ben cheated on Jen, the prenup was invalid and she would get half of everything. I'm paraphrasing. According to press reports this time, when they actually did get married, they did not have a prenuptial agreement, which is quite surprising and interesting if that's true. But what about these lifestyle clauses, cheating clauses? We hear a lot of different ones. What do you have to say about that?
So in California, they're not enforceable. And it's kind of why put it in the agreement. You don't want to, you know, jeopardize the validity of the whole agreement by having a clause in there that can be thrown out. So I don't put them in my agreements because they are not enforceable. That's one that I get asked about a lot, a cheating one. I've gotten asked about a weight gain clause, less money if the person gains weight. And I can't say who the couple is, but they're a Hollywood couple and they're actually still married. It's been like 20 some years. And he had asked for that, and I had said no. They actually are still married. So, you know, and you also can't pre-agree like where you're going to live if there's a divorce. You can't make someone, you know, live in the same state or say that they can't move. You know, you can't do that. So it's kind of why bother, you know, putting that in, since it's not enforceable. And there's plenty of other stuff to decide in the prenup. So
I like your practical approach. But you also mentioned something I want to circle back to about things you can't determine in a prenuptial agreement. And you mentioned about children. So I would like to make sure we highlight that for listeners.
So in California, we can't predetermine custody. So we can't say if there's a divorce and their children, you know, mom's going to have most of the time or dad's going to have most of the time. And we also can't predetermine child support. So those have to just be decided if and when.
Right. And I also think that's pretty universal in the United States. And generally, that comes down to the fact that what's in children's best interests is the overriding presumption, and you cannot predetermine what is in children's best interests, especially before they even exist. In a prenuptial agreement in many cases. So there will still be, and I always point this out to people, if you have a prenuptial agreement, there are still going to be financial issues that need to be discussed and determined at the time of a divorce if you have children, because now you'll have support issues. And as you just said, you'll have custodial issues. But a large part of what you would also have been discussing, perhaps spousal support, and your financial, the property settlement will often have already been determined, although that may vary now that you have children.
Yeah, I think one in California, at least, one of the most largely litigated issues is spousal support. And probably because California doesn't have a formula, so it lends itself to being a highly litigated issue. So if you can predetermine that, or even a formula to determine spousal support, because we don't have one, I mean, that in and of itself, will save a lot of time and attorney's fees than kind of just starting with what the default provides in California, which is a little all over the place. And depending on what judge you get and what side of the bed they woke up on, literally will decide the outcome. They're all it's all different from courthouse to county to judge. There's not a consistent outcome, and so that's why I also bring that up when I represent the less wealthier person, because there's no consistency. Spousal support in California, it's seen as very rehabilitative now, so we're not seeing long-term spousal support awards. So we can predetermine what you're going to get in terms of amounts if someone has their balance sheets already kind of what it's going to be, and they have the liquidity to make predetermined payments, or we have a formula that we can just plug into, and we define what's going to be income for purposes of that formula.
Well, and you just raised a really important consideration for those who are entering into prenuptial agreements. I want to point this out for my listeners. You just had a very nuanced explanation around predetermining spousal support and alimony in a prenuptial agreement, and then the various factors to be considered. I just want people to realize how important it is to have a knowledgeable and skilled attorney representing you and advising you when you are talking about these issues in your prenuptial agreement. Because when you're predetermining something like spousal support and you're making determinations that may not go into place for years to come, you want someone who can help you with that nuance of, do we want to set a certain amount, or do we want to put into place, as you just said, a formula so that it will take into consideration a lot of different situations that may arise over time, right? I always say the law degree did not come with a crystal ball, right? So we don't know what the future holds. So important. And you just casually slip that into the conversation. But what it says to me is you are clearly a very experienced practitioner who understands. And I want listeners to understand that as well. We're talking about these as if they're simple and, relatively simple things that people can understand. There's so much nuance to these financial issues that you're going to be talking about. And that's another reason why you want to start talking about this, not 3 months, not 3 weeks, not 3 days before the wedding. You want to have enough time, because I would imagine you also at times have other professionals involved as you're working through these financial terms in these prenuptial agreements.
Yeah, sometimes I do. I work at a firm where there's other practice areas other than family law, like estate planning, tax, corporate. So I'm pretty lucky that I can just pick up the phone and call someone. And I've been doing them for so long that I learn so much every time I do a new one. And now I've done, thousands. So I have a lot to I have a lot of samples to pick and choose from, or, oh, yeah, I remember when I did that, in that case, and this is very similar. Maybe they would like this idea. So by just doing so many, I've really, had to work through some of the issues that continuously come up. And so now I have some, a few different options for people that I've kind of thought through and worked through already, which is the nice thing about doing them so often for so long.
Right. Well, and I'll be honest, I have colleagues who just won't do them. I know several attorneys who basically have just eliminated prenups from their practice. And I think that goes back to maybe that more adversarial aspect where we had in the history of prenups, you usually had one spouse who was the wealthy or the well financially placed spouse, and then the one who was less advantaged. And so they could become very adversarial, or were treated almost as if it was, wealthy person versus gold digger or something of that nature. In fact, doesn't Kanye West have a song called Gold Digger, all about the prenup, right? So, but you're right. And this is another example I would like, just to point out to listeners, where finding a practitioner who has experience like you have is extremely valuable, not just from the fact that you've drafted so many of them that you're going to do that correctly, but also that each one's different, and we get creative with these agreements. We get creative with our clients, especially I would say in the mediation process. And so what another couple has done, it may not be what you end up wanting to do, but it may spark an idea for you. So that option generating is another aspect of both a mediated prenuptial agreement, but also an experienced practitioner that's so helpful.
Yes, exactly. I mean, to be honest, attorneys don't make a lot of money doing premarital agreements. I think, I did have one that was negotiated for 2 years, and I think that bill was $100,000. It was very complicated, but other than that, these are not generating a lot of fees. I think a lot of attorneys don't want to do them because of that, but I do them because I really like them, and I like the creative part of trying to come up with an idea that satisfies both people, is also legal, has no tax ramifications, and I like to work with happy people that are getting married. So it's a good balance to talking to my divorce clients, but I also am very passionate about premarital agreements. I think that everyone should have one, and that's why I do them, because I really believe in them. I think that, I think if you asked everyone getting married and you sat them down and told them what the default is, whether they have any money or they don't, they would probably disagree with something that the state already provides them. And if they had the opportunity, they would probably change that.
Right. Well, think about it. What the state provides is cookie cutter, right? It's been put in place to work, hopefully, for the vast majority of people, but we know that it doesn't work for everyone. And I think you're 100% correct that if most people even knew exactly what they were setting themselves up for financially and legally by entering into marriage, they'd at least want the opportunity to understand what that is and perhaps tweak it, or as we said, opt in or opt out of certain of the obligations. So I'm just wondering, as we bring this episode to a close, you've already mentioned, the weight gain clause, which kind of blows my mind. But any other good stories that you can share on a memorable prenup case?
Yes. So about 10 years ago, I had a client come in. She was maybe 30 at the time, 29 or 30. She didn't have very many assets, but she had an idea. And she told me what the idea was. And of course, I thought, oh, I don't know who's ever going to sign up for that. In my head, I don't know about that, if that's going to work. And she was also just engaged. And she said, I want a prenup because I want to protect my idea. I'm going to start a company and I'm going to see this idea through. And she was very adamant. And I don't remember where she had heard about prenups, but someone had obviously mentioned it to her. And she was very adamant about having one and very focused on protecting her idea and her business. And, we put together the agreement. It was signed. His businesses would be his, hers would be hers. And again, I never, she told me the idea and I just didn't see a market for it. But about 3 years later, I was in the airport and I was buying some magazines, in the airport store. And she was on the cover of Forbes, and her business is now valued at over $1 billion. So I am a horrible judge of, I could never be on Shark Tank. I'm like, edge of a good business idea. I mean, totally out of touch. And second, look, she didn't have anything. She owned a car and I think that was it, and rented an apartment. But, she had this idea and she knew she wanted to protect it. And look, it could have amounted to nothing. And maybe so she paid a couple $1,000s for the prenup. But look what she did. Now that business is her own. And if there is a divorce, there's not. But if there is, she can decide if anything, what she wants to give or not. So I was just blown away because she had such a tenacity and was very focused about doing this, and so young, and and then became uber successful. So
I was pretty uber successful if it's at $1 billion. It reminds me of the case of Jessica Simpson and Nick Lachey when they did have a prenup. But Nick was much more successful at the time than Jessica. And so the prenup basically was all based on protecting his wealth and said nothing, unfortunately, about protecting hers. And she, her popularity and finances exploded during that marriage. And she ended up having to make a sizable payout because of not having a prenup that went both ways. So glad neither one of us were the ones drafting that agreement from her perspective.
Yeah. Like you said, there's no crystal ball. You don't know. You could have an idea that goes nowhere, or it could hit it big, and at least you had some control over it and a discussion about it. And but it just goes to show you, you don't have to be rich to have one, or for it to become consequential later, become important somehow in your life later on, especially when you're young and you're getting married. You don't know what's going to happen 10, 15, 20 years down the road.
No, you really don't. I wish the law degree came with a crystal ball because, well, goodness, think of the things you and I could come up with if it had. But I really love this take on prenuptial agreements. I think you are 100% right. Prenups are going to become the norm. In fact, I think we're moving well into that space already. And I really appreciate that concept of it being a very positive step forward for your future, as opposed to something that people dread and don't want to enter into and do everything they can to avoid. So if my listeners would like to reach out to you, get more information, what's the best way to do that, Monica?
You can email me directly. It's MMAZZEI at Sideman, SIDEMAN.com.
And of course, we'll have that in the show notes, as well as links to Monica's website and her other information and her social media. I follow her on Instagram and LinkedIn. So be sure to reach out to her, get more information, consider a prenup so you don't end up like Jessica Simpson, so to speak, and go forward with it, thinking of consciously coupling. I really love that idea. So Monica, thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me.